Before introducing tonight's speakers, I'd like to tell you all a brief description of the Janus Forum, which is sort of the theme and sponsoring program of this evening's event. Janus Forum is a programming effort by the Political Theory Project, and the mission of the PTP is to invigorate the study of ideas and institutions that make societies free, prosperous, and fair. Second, we aim for all of our programming to promote interdisciplinary methods and ideological pluralism. But what does that mean? In short, we want to bring together individuals from different subject fields, different identities, and different value systems to think and discuss pressing social issues. Janus Forum lectures such as this one provide an event space where members of the Brown community can engage contrasting intellectual perspectives in their most sophisticated presentations by top scholars in direct comparison to one another. When designing Janus lectures, we simply try to think who are the most established members of an academic profession whom have a substantial disagreement in their research field. Having recently been appointed the responsibility of designing Janus events, tonight's theme was the first and most obvious to come to mind. The question of wealth, why some countries are so rich while others are so poor, has vexed economists for centuries. Professors Jeffrey Sachs and Daron Acemoglu are amongst the world's leading experts on comparative economic development, and yet view the nature and resolution to this puzzle in substantially different ways that yield sometimes conflicting practical and political implications. The format for tonight's event is straightforward. Each presenter, beginning with Professor Acemoglu, will discuss the motivations and findings of their research for approximately 35 minutes each. Following both presentations, we'll have a formal question and answer period where you can voice questions and comments about the different presentations for equal length of time. Thereafter, we'll conclude our formal moderated discussion, and everybody will be free to continue enjoying conversation, and we've got the room until about 8:30 is my understanding. Now I'd like to introduce our first presenter. Professor Daron Acemoglu is the Elizabeth and James Killian Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was the recipient of the John Bates Clark Medal in 2005, and his research interests focus on the political, economic, and social causes of differences in economic development across societies, the factors affecting the institutional and political evolution of nations, and how technology impacts growth and distribution of resources, and is itself determined by economic and social incentives. In addition to dozens, if not hundreds, of scholarly articles, Daron Acemoglu has published 4 books: Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, co-authored with James Robinson, which was awarded the Woodrow Wilson and William Riker Prizes, Introduction to Modern Economic Growth, and Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, again, co-authored with James Robinson, which was a New York Times bestseller in 2012, and Principles of Economics, co-authored with David Leibson and John Les. Please join me in welcoming Professor Acemoglu.
Hi. I don't know whether this is right. Can increase it a little bit. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for everybody for being here. And following the instructions that Dan gave me, I was going to talk a little bit about world inequality. So a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about here are based on joint work with James Robinson. And what I thought I would do is I would sort of review some of the sort of way of thinking that James and I tried to develop, and then also look a little bit into the future, into sort of the work that we are doing right now that builds on that, and hopefully will be the basis of a lot more work in the years to come. So this picture is very familiar. It shows a map of the world with different colors representing different incomes per capita. And it highlights a couple of things. One is huge amount of disparity in the world. So this is one aspect of world inequality. Of course, there's a lot of inequality within countries, but this is inequality between fairly aggregated units. 1/50th of the income per capita is in some of those dark areas relative to, say, the United States or the richest parts of Western Europe. That's, really mind-boggling levels of inequality. And this is what motivates a lot of our research and a lot of the research that many economists and other social scientists have been doing over centuries, if not the last several decades. But also associated with that, and sometimes perhaps slightly less emphasized but equally important, is that there are huge differences in different aspects of the quality of life, however you measure it. So for example, this is the same sort of map with the same color coding, dark red corresponding to bad outcomes and green, darker going towards darker corresponding to better outcomes, is infant mortality. So here the gap is even larger, about more than 100%, 100-fold between the lowest infant mortality places and the highest infant mortality places. So that's equally mind-boggling in an age which is, we're in a globalized, connected world. All of the technologies are available for dealing with infant mortality, which is not the hardest problem. You're not sending a rocket to Mars here, but the extent to which this gets not done in over perhaps about 40% of the world is really pretty amazing. This one here is security of life. You can measure this in various different ways. The easiest one is homicides. Again, you have over 100-fold differences in homicides, which are just again incredible in terms of inability of some societies to control violence of some citizens against other citizens. So the other thing that you can note in all of these three figures, and I can show you several more, but I think these three do make the point that I want to communicate, is that not only there is a huge amount of inequality, but there is a lot of geographic clustering. So the red areas are around each other, and the green areas are around each other, and so on. So some natural ideas that you might have had about trying to explain why public services, why quality of life, why security of life, why income per capita are so clustered and unequal is perhaps that there are some geographic factors that explain that. Or perhaps there are some geographically clustered cultural factors, such as national cultures or Hispanic versus Anglo-Saxon or versus Islamic culture. By its nature, all of these things are very geographically clustered. Perhaps these are sort of accounting for it. So in a series of articles starting in the 1990s and then sort of culminating in the book that James Robinson and I wrote entitled Why Nations Fail, the argument that we try to develop is that the better, the more fruitful way of thinking about these differences and hence the geographic correlation that you see is not in terms of these geographic or cultural factors, but what we call institutions, the formal and informal regulations that guide how people do behave, that set constraints and determine incentives in their economic, social, and political lives. In particular, we've distinguished between extractive and inclusive economic institutions, not because those are the most common ways that you can sort of see countries, but they are sort of ideal types, polar cases that give us some clarity of mind in thinking about the difference arrangements. And in fact, the inclusive economic institutions are not that much different from what you learn in your first economic course. When you start studying principles of economics, all of you here have done that, you will be introduced to a hypothetical world in which property rights are well enforced. People are happy to choose, people are free to choose whichever occupation they get in, or firms are entirely free in entering into different occupations, into different businesses as the profitability and their ideas dictate. But also, and again, implicit in many of the principles of economics courses, including one that you can take based on our book with David Leibson and John List, is that there is a government set of institutions, such as courts that act in a way that enforce the law, enforce contracts, and don't favor one set of people at the expense of others. And also, those government institutions do regulate economic activities. For example, if you want to dump toxic waste into my backyard, you won't be allowed to do that, and so on and so forth. And they provide public services such as infrastructure, healthcare, education, and so on. So in other words, these inclusive economic institutions provide both a level playing field, fairly equal access to opportunities, economic opportunities, and also they provide the right sort of incentives for people, both individuals as workers and entrepreneurs, and firms to exploit those incentives. And at the other end of the spectrum are these extractive economic institutions, and just think of it loosely speaking as the negation of everything I've told in terms of inclusive economic institutions. And the key thing, however, is that, and I'm going to emphasize this point a little bit more in a second, is that these extractive economic institutions don't emerge as a result of some mistaken economic theory. They're not the result of some mistakes that just get made for innocent reasons. Most of the time, they are the result of purposeful choices that a society makes because these extractive economic institutions benefit some people at the expense of others. So if you introduce monopolies and entry barriers, and if you sort of reserve some occupations to some specific groups of people, or if you make sure that the laws apply not equally to everybody, you're creating winners and losers. And the winners are the beneficiaries, and the losers are just the rest of society. And to designate that, we often talk of an elite. The elite here means the economic and political elite who are the beneficiaries of these sorts of arrangements. But of course, these sorts of arrangements do not exist in a vacuum. So let me give you an example to both highlight what I mean by extractive economic institutions and what I mean by them not existing in a vacuum. Take, for example, a quintessential example of extractive economic institutions, slavery. By the way, that's not a crazy institution to consider. If you look at most of human history, that's a much, much more common way in which labor was deployed than free labor markets in which people go and compete for different jobs and different labor services. So take, for example, 17th century Barbados, which happens to be one of the richest countries in the world at the time. It was a country where 80% of the population were slaves. This 80% of the population in one of the richest countries in the world worked under extremely harsh conditions. Many males died before the age of 30 because working conditions were so harsh and their wages were just above or just below subsistence, depending on how you measure them. So how could a society like that emerge, and how could a society like that persist? You have 80% suffering under such inhumane conditions while you have untold wealth by the standards of the time. And the answer is very simple. Look at the way in which the political side of the equation was organized. You have a society in which the military played a major role because the slaves were not happy slaves. They weren't there because they loved it, but because they were repressed. So in Barbados, as in Jamaica, as in Cuba, as in Haiti, the slave revolts were just a very common occurrence, and they were always put down by extreme force, by the military. Well, who controlled the military? Not just at 20%, but in fact there were about 100 families which were the biggest landowners. They owned the plantations, owned most of the slaves, and those were the very fertile lands out of which sugar was grown, which was the source of the wealth in Barbados, and they made most of the money. Many of them, were highly mobile between Britain and Barbados, and they actually directly and indirectly controlled it. Not only the army played a role that was very essential for their existence, but also the top generals of the military came from those families. What about the law? The law was crucial. Barbados was not a lawless island. It wasn't like free for all. It wasn't the sort of the Wild West. Well, it turns out that the top judges of the island, the equivalent of the Supreme Court judges or the Constitutional Court judges, came predominantly from the same families. What about the legislature and the governors? Well, they came from the same family also. So when you look at a society like that, you have a picture of political power and political voice being highly concentrated in the hands of a very small group of people. Actually, it happens to be those who were the economic beneficiaries of the slavery system and the plantation complex. And that sort of dynamic of the political structure very much dovetailed the economic structure in which 80% were slaves and were working for the benefit of the 2 or 3% that were the very wealthy plantation owners. So this already points out that you really have to think about this in a more holistic way, not just the economic incentives, not just economic opportunities, but how the political system really works with those. So for that, we very much put the spotlight on political arrangements, political institutions. So in particular, we talk of inclusive and extractive political institutions, not because we were not very creative and couldn't come up with two other terms, well, that might have been true also, but mostly because we wanted to emphasize that there is a synergistic relationship between inclusive economic institutions and inclusive political institutions, and extractive economic institutions and extractive political institutions. And as my description suggests, one aspect of inclusive economic institutions, or one aspect of extractive economic institutions, is about the distribution of political power. Is political power broadly distributed? If it is, that looks more like an inclusive political system. Or is it narrowly distributed, very highly monopolized? If it is, then it looks more like an extractive political system. Moreover, it also matters what constraints are placed on the exercise of that political power. Political power might be broadly distributed, but every 6 years we vote and we make one person the king and the dictator. For the next 6 years, that person can act without any constraints whatsoever from the media, from civil society, from a legislature, from the court. Well, that's not going to be our view of an inclusive political system. So you require both a broad distribution of political power, something that looks like democracy, but you need much more than a democracy. You need all these supporting institutions to provide the right sort of checks, constraints, and continuous voice coming from society. But even that, we argued, was not enough. You can take a society like Somalia, actually quite modern Somalia. You have a society which doesn't have a clearly well-identified elite. It has a society in which political power is vested in clan families, and it's very much decided by elders or how the society works. But if you look at the political system, it's highly dysfunctional. If you look at how this reflects into the economic system, it's highly dysfunctional. And the main reason we argued, which is not a sort of a shocking news to political scientists here, is that it does not satisfy the sort of view that Hobbes had and has been transmitted to political scientists through Weber and lots of others, that you actually need some degree of political centralization so that state institutions emerge and exist above society to be able to emphasize their authority to enforce law and order, to enforce law, to regulate economic activity. All of that is entirely absent in Somali society. If I run into you in the road, that might lead to a big blood feud because there is no court system that can really adjudicate those conflicts. So therefore, we emphasize that what you really need is this two-legged political system. You need the inclusivity that comes from what we call pluralism, the voices of many being heard in the right way, and the political centralization. And failure of either component, we talked of extractive political institutions, because extractive political institutions naturally fed into these extractive economic institutions that we were talking about in the previous slide. And so this little box here is supposed to communicate that there is absolutely no necessity that political institutions that are extractive have to travel always with political economic institutions that are extractive. So you don't necessarily need to be on the diagonal here, inclusive, extractive. But if you are off diagonal, there are going to be greater forces pushing you in one direction or the other. So if you're in this off diagonal, where you are politically extractive and economically somewhat inclusive, well, it's going to be hard to stay there for a while. Either there are going to be forces that make you go in the inclusive direction economically also, inclusive direction in the politically also, or going to push you back in the extractive direction in the economic sphere. So, as I said already, but it bears repeating, the idea, the main thesis is that growth is much more likely under inclusive economic and political institutions. This is not to claim that growth is impossible under extractive institutions. On the contrary, there are many, many examples in history of what we call extractive growth, but those tend to be more short-lived or more unstable. So sustained economic growth, the one that really requires technological change to be ongoing for a long time, really requires the inclusivity, because this combination of incentives and opportunity is really key for that. But why is that? Why is it that even extractive societies, even kleptocratic dictators like Mugabe or Mobutu, don't want to have this sustained growth, technological development, innovation, entrepreneurship? Why can't they try to cultivate that? And the answer we sort of give to that is really threefold. One is that it's very hard to trust these big dictators to really be giving you the incentives, because there is really no law that will really maintain them, because the pluralism, the inclusivity of the political system is absent. Secondly, often they have their economic interests, like a monopolist benefiting from entry barriers, in the continuation of an extractive system. And third, and most importantly, we emphasize the fact that they might actually be political losers from economic growth or transitions to more inclusive political or economic system. So in other words, their political power emanates from the continuation of extractive institutions. So it would be very difficult for them to continue to have an ongoing control over the political system once they start the process of reform. So if you have a serfdom-based system or a slavery-based system, once you free the slave, it's going to be very difficult for somebody who was getting all of his political power, just like the plantation owners in Barbados or the big surf owners in Russia, to then maintain the same sort of position without being challenged. So, of course, I'm making a lot of claims here, but, why is this sort of plausible? Well, I can't really give you more detailed evidence on why these ideas are very useful in explaining more detailed econometric or statistical evidence, but, because I don't have the sort of time for that. But what I want to do is I want to just visit one canonical case of economic divergence to talk about these ideas. And that's the contrast of the south and the north of this continent, the Americas, because it really sort of captures several of the points that I want to sort of emphasize. First of all, it's a very recent phenomenon as these things go. There is no doubt that the sort of inequalities that we are observing today between the North and the South did not exist 500 years ago. And moreover, we have an example where we can really see the origins of the institutions, because all of these institutions were not just at the whim of the colonialists, but very much were influenced by these colonialists. So let's look at, for example, the colonization, one of the first expeditions that the conquistadors organized into Latin America. Well, before Cortés, certainly before Pizarro, was a man by the name of Juan Díaz de Solís. Most of you would not have heard of him, but that's for a very good reason, because he's not one of the very successful conquistadors who went into history books. He landed in what is today Argentina, the very bottom of the continent, in 1516, and started the colonization of the continent. He was very excited because they had discovered some silver there. Bad luck, it actually wasn't silver that was from the region, but was coming all the way from the Inca parts. And even people under him discovered Buenos Aires. But actually, Juan Díaz de Solís would not see any of those. He would be soon clubbed to death by a band of native people, the Charruas. The Charruas and another group called the Carandi were the only people he encountered in those places. And the Charruas and the Carandi were very sparsely settled, hunter-gatherers, not used to sedentary life. Then when they were encountering the conquistadors, they fought back with their clubs, and that's one of these episodes in which they killed Juan Díaz de Solís. And even when they were captured, they were totally unused to agricultural work or being able to be in a hierarchy in which they would just follow the orders of their Spanish masters. So this was not the sort of propositions that the Spaniards were waiting for. This was anybody who's been to that area knows this is an amazingly fertile land. But in this fertile land, they started starving because they were entirely unprepared to grow their own land, and the Charruas and the Carandi were not helping. And when they were just about to throw in the towel, one of the other conquistadors, a man by the name of Juan de Ayolas, discovered what is today Asunción, capital of Paraguay. There was another band of native people, the Guarani, but the Guarani were different than the Carandi and the Charruas, because in particular they were already settled. They had their own princes, they had their own hierarchy, they had started a little bit of agriculture, nothing comparable to the Maya a couple of hundred years ago, or the Inca or the Aztecs, but this was a civilization of the sort that they could handle. Immediately they overpowered them with their weapons, they declared themselves the elite, they married some of the princesses, and they took the Guarani institutions and adapted them to better serve their purposes. So you see the emergence of things like the encomienda or other forced labor systems that they would later perfect in the context of the colonization of the Inca or the Aztec. And I'm going to skip this part, but there is a very clear line of persistence of these institutions throughout Latin American history. So this is a very, very clear example, when you looked at it through the lenses of our setup of extractive economic institutions, very much supported by extractive political institutions. And it was done for the benefit of the few, the elites that were Spanish, but also their local allies. That was very important. Just a few people wouldn't be enough. They needed the local elites to support them. But very much at the expense of the rest of the population of the Guarani, later on the rest of the population of the Aztecs and the Incas. What about in the north? Well, the north is super interesting because the north, though colonized later by the English mostly, followed a model of colonization extremely similar to what happened in the south. The Virginia Company, very much inspired by the experiences of the Spanish, had a model of colonization almost to the letter following what the Spanish were doing. In fact, even the people that the Virginia Company, starting in 1607, started sending to the Jamestown colony were very much modeled. You know, they sent soldiers and goldsmiths because they were the useful people for the Spaniards. And they colonized Jamestown, but actually they went through more or less exactly the same sort of steps that the Spaniards went through. So first they encountered a band of mobile hunter-gatherers, sparsely settled people who would not cooperate with them. They went through their starving time, you know, whether they were saved by Pocahontas or whatever, but, you know, it was not a happy time. But, very differently from the Spaniards, they did not have an option of finding Asuncion, finding the Aztecs, finding the Incas, because there were none to a first approximation. So quickly, the Virginia Company realized that they were going bankrupt. The Virginia Company, by the way, was a very responsive company. It was a chartered company in London and had all of these shareholders which were up in arms because they were losing their money. They said, we have to come up with a second strategy. Well, their second strategy was, okay, we cannot enslave the local population, so we cannot extract the rents from them. So let's take all of the people who are poor and desperate in Europe and ship them over. So they brought these sort of settlers from England, and they would be the workers, and the elite of the Jamestown, in particular the soldiers and the governors, etc., would again be sitting on top of them, tell them what to do, and the money would go to them and to the shareholders in London. So to just give you a little bit of a sense of how they had envisaged this colony, well, read the laws that they passed. So Sir Thomas Gates was the governor of the island at the time, and Sir Thomas Dale his deputy governor. So it reads, no man or woman shall run away from the colony to the Indians upon pain of death. Anybody who robs a garden, public or private, or a vineyard, or who steals ears of corn shall be punished with death. No member of the colony will sell or give any commodity of this country to a captain, mariner, master, or sailor to transport out of the colony or for his own private uses upon pain of death. So you see, this is a very repressive colony, and it wasn't repressive for wanton reason. They were trying to control the labor, which was the most expensive commodity at the time, because they had shipped all this labor. But no matter, the open frontier was too attractive, and they couldn't force the English settlers into gang labor and low wages. So a mere 11 years after the founding of Jamestown Colony, in 1618, they gave up. They gave up on their second strategy. And they did something quite revolutionary. They introduced private property rights and what I would recognize, or what I would identify as inclusive economic institutions for the first time on the island. They introduced a system on the continent. They introduced something called the head right system, where each settler colony would have 50 acres of land, and they could grow whatever they wanted on it. They could sell whatever they grew. They would decide how much to fertilize the land, which crops to grow, and all of that. Great. Sounds fantastic from our economist bones. This is exactly the sort of thing they should have done. But there was only one catch. Just a year ago, Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale were threatening you with death because you were selling an ear of corn to a mariner, and now they're telling you, yeah, you have this private property right, you can do whatever you want, we're just here to support you. Well, you'll be excused for being a little bit suspicious that they may not be as credible as they say. So you see here the tension between political and economic institutions. So 1 year later, another revolution followed, a political one. For the first time on the continent, now there was a General Assembly where political power was shifted entirely to the to the settlers. And these were not just unique to Jamestown, which actually was not a successful colony at the end, but very similar events happened in the Chesapeake Bay, in Maryland, in Carolinas. You see exactly the same effort, trying to force the settlers, unsuccessful, give them economic incentives, then give them political power. The other reason why these episodes are so interesting, to me anyway, is that you see that, at least in this very symptomatic case, you really can't make much progress with geography, with culture, or with any other sort of explanations that have been often emphasized. Geography, the South was geographically as well endowed, if not more endowed, as the North. In fact, the reason why you can see that very clearly is because at the time that Europeans arrived, there is no doubt that South America was more prosperous. It had much more developed civilizations, much greater population density, huge urban centers, very developed art, very developed science relative to what the North had. So it can't be that there was some agricultural advantage or some other geographic advantage that's the reason why we see the North prospering and the South not prospering. It can't be that much of a cultural explanation either. Not only the culture of the native population was not that important, but the culture of the Europeans wasn't second order, wasn't first order here either. In fact, whatever their religion or their specific way of praying to God may have been, the Spaniards and the English followed to the letter the same colonization strategy. The difference was that in one case they were successful, the Spaniards, in the other case they were unsuccessful. It was that failure of the plan to set up extractive institutions that is at the root of the North's success. And that also emphasizes that this is not some sort of policy genius. It wasn't some sort of story where, the North had very good policy advisors who told them what macroeconomic policies to adopt. Some of us might believe that economists have a special role in, propelling economic growth. Well, please. But, this case really tells you the story. It was the failure, not the success of people like Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale. All of their dreams were dashed. It was the success of people like Pizarro and Cortez and Ayolas that really led to the failure of Latin America. And the other lesson, extractive economic institutions, extractive political institutions really come from the ability of the elite to control political power. And it is not their willingness to lead to inclusive institutions, but really from demands from below that often lead to the demise of these extractive economic and political institutions. So one thing, however, I have not emphasized so far, except implicitly in my discussion of political centralization, is actually extremely important, not only to sort of close the circle of thinking much more about things like infant mortality, security, quality of life, quality of judicial institutions, but also really as a glue to hold institutions together. And I'm going to call that state capacity, the capability of the state to do stuff effectively, have a competent bureaucracy, have a state that can provide public goods, that can control violence, that can regulate economic activity if necessary. There is a huge amount of variation in that also. So if you look at, for example, one very simple-minded measure, tax revenue. Tax revenue as a fraction of GDP is as low as 5% in some of sub-Saharan Africa. And contrary to what you might have expected, actually it's the rich countries that tax more. So what's going on here? Well, what I'm going to tell you is that we really need to think about this state capacity in a more holistic way. And here is the main idea that I want to give you in this regard. And this goes in a very different direction than most of the accepted views about how states develop in political science. For example, views going back to Sam Huntington that have been recirculated a lot by people like Fukuyama and et al. So here is, on the horizontal axis, what I've put is pluralism, which was, remember, one aspect of what I call inclusive political institutions. And on the vertical axis, I have strength of the state. So what this is essentially a phase diagram with two state variables on the two horizontal and the vertical axis. And what this says is that you have three regions with a bifurcation between these regions. In what I've called region 1, you start with too strong society. Pluralism, social norms of controlling political power are extremely strong, so you can never have the first steps of political centralization, so state capacity and state building never get off the ground. In this part here, the state is very strong to start with. It's a despotic society, if you want to think of it that way. And pluralism, civil society is too weak. And in those places, the state is going to be strong, but not very competent, actually. So most of those are going to be what we call paper leviathans rather than Thomas Hobbes's actual leviathans. Why are they paper leviathans? I'll return to that in the conclusion, in the question and answer session. But the more interesting part here is what we call inclusive state building. So the inclusive state building is the area where the inclusive political institutions, which I've been emphasizing, happily meet with state capacity development. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that when you start from a society in which neither civil society is too strong to strangle political centralization, nor society in which the state institutions are too despotic to totally stifle civil society or pluralism, you can have a process in which they co-evolve and they both get strong over time. And let me give you one example to sort of flesh this out just a little bit, and that's the ancient Greece. Ancient Greece is, fascinating, but, it's much more fascinating than a cursory look at democracy, Athenian democracy would suggest. First of all, it has a history of empire and despotic growth during the Bronze Age, but its golden age is around 700 BC, when you have not only a much more sophisticated set of state institutions emerge, but the Athenian democracy emerged, for example, in Athena or Attica. And, a crucial thing is a man named Solon, whose reforms in around 600 BC started a very, very different age. For example, Solon introduced a bunch of economic reforms, which you would recognize as inclusive. He banned surfing of Athenian citizens. He established freedom of movement within Attica, implemented an egalitarian land reform, something that was sorely missing within Attica. And political, he introduced essentially a very primitive form of Athenian democracy. But also, he generally started shaping social norms so that powerful people would not be able to boss their way around. So, for example, he started giving a lot of rights to regular Athenian citizens. And then these were consolidated about 80 years later by a man named Cleisthenes, which further developed these political reforms, but also introduced a whole host of regulations trying to prevent the powerful people, the rich people, having their ways in all sorts of ways. And during this period, you don't just have, the form of democracy, you have the most amazing state building. You have during this period a modern bureaucracy, raising taxes, roads, bridges, controlling borders. The Athenian state starts caring for orphans, for the disabled, things that, you would not see for, perhaps 2,000 more years throughout in other parts of the world. So, how does this sort of work? Well, let me sort of skip the part that's about the political reform. But one very interesting part I just want to point out, because it's so much fun, is Solon's hubris law, which made behavior aimed at humiliation and intimidation against any resident of Athens Greek illegal. So this is like even more modern than anything you've seen within Europe, perhaps until the sort of political correctness movement. But then Cleisthenes even sort of goes beyond that and introduces something called the ostracism law. And the ostracism law is specifically aimed at keeping in check the most powerful people within society. So essentially, people, if at least 6,000 citizens write the names of a particular person on fragments of broken pottery called ostrakon, so that's why the word ostracism comes from. So Stelios is nodding, so I know I'm not totally wrong on this one. Then you actually have a vote, and this person is going to be banished for 11 years. And amazingly, this is actually used against it's not used that often, only 11 people but it's used among some of the most strongest people. So one of them is Themistocles, the biggest perhaps military hero who went against everything and beat the Persians and everything. And this guy is ostracized, and he just follows the order. He leaves Athens for 11 years. He was getting too big for his bridges, and the Athenian society sends him away. So you have here an amazing development of social norms and strength of civil society against elites going together with the most unparalleled building of state bureaucracy. So this is the idea of what I was trying to communicate here. So what I want to emphasize is state capacity, which is, there has been a lot more work over thinking about state capacity in economics over the last 15 years perhaps. And we need much more. But if you want to understand state capacity, you don't want to approach it like Huntington. You don't want to approach it like many other people have done, which is like an engineering project. You don't build state capacity by building modern bureaucracy, bringing better control mechanism, bringing big data. You do it by having the right political institutions so that state institutions are in a balanced way with civil society. So actually, I'm going to skip this entirely, but often interpreted differently. If you look at state building in England, it follows an exactly similar pattern. And I'm going to follow that. And I'll just end with two other observations. One is that, this sounds very much like political science, and it is, but economics is not absent here, because economic incentives and technology are key in determining where the boundaries of these different regions are. So in fact, some anthropologists have emphasized that the roots of Athenian democracy are very much in the technological switch from bronze to iron. When you had bronze, the economic relations were such that political power, military power, was very much concentrated in the hands of a very few people. And when you go to the Iron Age, military power becomes decentralized, and lots of more economic activity becomes decentralized, and that's very much more conducive to a situation in which this sort of inclusive state building might actually go on. And then the last thing I want to sort of emphasize, the part that I've skipped here, but given that time is short, what are the dynamics in Region 1 and Region 3? I'm very happy to talk about that in the question and answer session. If you sort of take inclusive and extractive economic institutions and political institutions, there aren't that many suggestions for policy. In particular, most of the policy implications that we emphasize in the book are about things you shouldn't do. You shouldn't undermine inclusive economic institutions. You shouldn't just become slaves to extractive economic institutions. But, we were definitely not pretending to be in a position to give policy advice. But once you start thinking about state capacity, even though I would still not be pretending to be in a position to give policy advice, I think there are better clues about how to think about policy. And in particular, especially at the local level, where state capacity very often resides, it's very, very important to start thinking about the balance of civil society and balance of state power. So if you actually follow any of the policies that were pushed, for example, by the US military in building the state in Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, they're often going to be counterproductive. Why? Because they are very much pushing down civil society. They're very much destroying pluralism for the sake of building a monopoly of violence. But in the meantime, they're also undermining any hope of the sort of dynamics that I was emphasizing in this region too. So going through a process, whatever economic aid, whatever economic help, whatever economic advice, whatever political or military sort of cooperation, going through a channel in which you don't try to destroy civil society in the process, or in fact you try to strengthen civil society in the process, might actually work much better. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Professor Acemoglu. Time magazine referred to Jeff Sachs as the world's best-known economist, which makes him incredibly easy to introduce. He serves as the director of the Health Institute and Quitlet Professor of Sustainable Development and Professor of Health Policy and Management at Columbia University. Professor Sachs' research focuses on economic development, global macroeconomics, and the fight against poverty. In addition to dozens of academic articles, he has authored 5 books, including 3 New York Times bestsellers: The End of Poverty, Commonwealth, Economics for a Crowded Planet, The Price of Civilization, To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace, and The Age of Sustainable Development. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sachs.
Good evening. Nice to be here, and thank you very much. I'm glad Daron and I agreed on his last sentence at least, which is that it's not a good idea to invade Afghanistan, Iraq, or other countries. I just think it's a little more complicated. And I just can't see it as this kind of one-dimensional set of issues. And my experience in working all over the world tells me that there's a lot more going on. My understanding of history tells me that there's a lot more going on, and that I think we really benefit from fleshing out a much more complex environment. I want to go back to those maps right at the beginning. I think I'm going in the right direction. Yeah. Let me start with infant mortality, because that indeed is really a pressing question, and one that I've worked a lot on in the last 15 years, and where we've seen a reduction of infant mortality in the high infant mortality regions of usually more than half over the last 15 years. My view is that infant mortality is a problem of disease burden and poverty, and that if you focus on those challenges, you can actually help to bring about a dramatic and significant improvement in circumstances. Why is Africa so burdened with disease, as is shown there? Actually, it's very easy to show statistically that controlling for per capita income, Africa's disease burden is way above what you would explain simply by income differences, though income is definitely a factor. But it's also the case that the disease ecology is really nasty. And we know that it's been really nasty throughout history. One of the most important killers is malaria. Malaria, specifically the kind that kills falciparum plasmodium, is a disease that is a warm temperature disease. It's a tropical disease. It's a disease that transmits when the temperature is 18 degrees Celsius or higher, roughly speaking. That's for reasons of the life cycle of the parasite. We know that tropical climates, and especially tropical climates that have enough precipitation for mosquito breeding, have always been zones of high malaria and other similar vector-borne diseases. It happens for a lot of very deep reasons also that the kind of malaria transmission in Africa is worse, actually, for a quite interesting reason relevant to this discussion as well. And that is that the mosquitoes that transmit malaria, which are called Anopheles mosquitoes, have several different phenotypes, several different behavioral types specifically in terms of feeding. And the kind of Anopheles mosquitoes in Africa bite people, whereas the kind of mosquitoes in other parts of the tropical world tend to bite cattle more and only feed on people maybe a third of the time. Whereas Anopheles gambiae and Anopheles funestus, which are the African species, are almost 100% human biters. If you think about it, you need 2 human bites in a row to transmit the disease, because the mosquito picks up the bite from an infected person and then after about a 2-week interval transmits the plasmodium to another person. That 2 weeks is temperature dependent. That's why this is a temperature dependent disease. The fact that you need 2 human bites in a row means that if you look at the epidemiology of this disease, it is to the squared power of what's called the human biting index, or the fraction of bites that falls on humans rather than cattle. So if you have a kind of mosquito that much of rural India has, Anopheles staphensis, which has a human biting index of 0.3, you take the square of that, 0.09, compared to Anopheles gambiae, which has a human biting index of 1, it's a factor of 10 already in what's called the force of transmission. And that shows up powerfully in the natural history of this disease. It's not for nothing that the west coast of Africa until the late 19th century was called the white man's graveyard, because anytime a European without the acquired immunity of having survived the childhood through this disease with multiple infections would show up, they'd be dead 6 months later when the trading ship returned back to pick them up, or when they tried to occupy a fort on the coast of West Africa. And we see that in the genetics of the region, because we know that there are some genetic mutations, specifically what's called hemoglobin S, which shows up as sickle cell anemia, that is protective of malaria when it's heterozygously inherited. In other words, when you have one of the 2 alleles that is a mutation of the hemoglobin. And you can back out from what's called the Hardy-Weinberg equation, the burden of deaths from malaria, by looking at the proportion of the population that carries a particular allele. The reason being that if you get 2 of these inheritances, you die of sickle cell anemia in a preclinical environment. If you get 1, it's protective. And then by the balance of these forces, you can estimate the share of malaria deaths that are occurring by the frequency of the hemoglobin S anomaly in this in a population. Turns out in West Africa, where basically African-American sickle cell anemia arises from, and where you have the world high of sickle cell anemia, you find that the burden of malaria in genetic time, meaning over the course of generations, so that these Hardy-Weinberg frequency laws apply, was absolutely out of sight on the planet. Malaria has always been a killer. Why, by the way, do the mosquitoes not bite the cattle rather than the humans? It's surmised, not for sure, but because there weren't cattle in West Africa, because trypanosomiasis, another warm weather tropical disease, basically led to a large zone where tsetse flies and trypanosomes prevented the kind of mixed cultivation of crop and animal that is prevalent, say, in India, where you have the kind of mosquito that likes to bite cattle. So it's a coevolution that also reflects an underlying disease burden. Okay, why do I give this little vignette? Because once you understand the basic dynamics, then turns out you can control malaria much better. You understand the dynamics of the disease, you can make an intervention. Why don't these countries control malaria on their own? What's the matter with them? Is it their politics? They don't care, they like to die, or maybe they're very, very poor. Well, my analysis and many others said that poverty meant that there wasn't the capacity to even implement the basic control interventions. When people argued, well, it's because of despotic governments or corruption and so forth, so you can't even make an intervention like giving away a bed net or doing other things seemed to me to be rather peculiar, because working with these governments was not really much different from working with governments in many other parts of the world where the malaria burden was much less because the disease ecology was much less. I fought for many, many years to implement 3 interventions. First, to recommend a global fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, which I designed in 2000, and Kofi Annan and I helped to introduce in 2001. And that was the first time in decades that there was even an attempt to bring resources to bear to control malaria in the so-called holoendemic regions of sub-Saharan Africa. Then I fought for 4 years to try to get the Bush administration to do something, and finally in 2005 they introduced what became called PMI, the President's Malaria Initiative. And this was an added level of resources. And then for the life of me, I could not achieve a basic idea for 7 years. And that was that poor people could not afford the bed nets and the medicines that they needed to stay alive. And many of my colleagues in the economics profession said, you can't give this away, that's unfair, that's cheating, that's not according to our budget constraints, the diagram doesn't allow for free distribution. If you give away the nets, they'll be cut into wedding veils, fishing nets, whatever silliness was said. And finally in 2007, after we had shown that you could give away nets and people save a lot of lives, finally in 2007 the World Health Organization advocated for free distribution of bed nets, and that started in 2007, 2008, and several 100 million bed nets were given out. Simultaneously, through the Gates Foundation and other initiatives, there were important breakthroughs in diagnostic testing, and there were innovations in using outreach workers, community health workers. Now malaria is down by 60 to 70% over the course of the last decade. Millions of lives are being saved. It's allowing for not only a tremendously reduced disease burden, but healthier children who can go to school, who don't have many of the debilities of having frequent and sometimes devastating sequelae of malaria infections. This is actually controllable and addressable. There was, for me, a little bit of a humorous, but it was a serious NBR paper a year ago trying to puzzle out, which for our profession seems to be a big puzzle, but I don't find it such a puzzle. How did the nets get to the right places? Because the researchers are absolutely convinced that principal agent problems meant that it would be impossible to do something like this. And they undertake research to discover a concept that they coin as pro-sociality of the health workers. In other words, that the health workers did their job. And they helped the households get the bed nets. To me, nothing remarkable. I work with health workers. I married one 36 years ago. Best move of my life. And I know that they're trained to do a good job and that it's possible to introduce an effective system and that you can make some real progress. In AIDS, we had a similar situation in 2000, as late as the end of 2001, there wasn't one African, not a single African, among the 20 to 25 million infected that was getting antiretroviral medicines on any kind of officially supported program. I've never seen people left to die that way in my life. And it was one of my recommendations that we treat sick people because we have life-saving drugs. And while the price of the drug in the US market was $10,000 for a yearly regimen, the production cost was about $300 at the time. That's the markup that patent rights allow. And the production cost has come down to about $100 now. Now there are several million people alive and tens of millions of children who are not orphaned as a result of the simple matter of designing a basic system to help keep people alive. Now, then it said this isn't economic development. I really strongly disagree with that. This is part of what economic development is. Economic development is also building infrastructure and generating the basis for industry and for private business on the basis of roads, power, and other things that have similar features to them. I just find the situation a lot more complicated, and the dynamics of why we are where we are a lot more complicated than national politics or simple explanations that are given, and I find not what we could be doing when we look closely, when we try to understand, when we try to design and reason our approaches. I don't really accept these categories as Daron has just defined them, even in the context of the stories that he told. The American settlers brought inclusive institutions, we're told, and then just committed genocide across the American continent and brought millions of slaves and enslaved millions and millions of people with these inclusive institutions. And the genocides were real, by the way. We barely have any relation to them. We can't imagine as Americans a genocidal history. We know something about cowboys and Indians. I'm old enough now that I played cowboys and Indians. I don't think children still play cowboys and Indians. But you know, the more you look and try to understand our history, if you look closely, it's got so many ghastly elements to it that ghastly really is the only word. There's always a mix in this, and the same institutions that created these inclusive institutions enslaved millions to the point where we were just about the only place on the whole planet that had to have a civil war to end slavery. Even Russia didn't have to have a civil war to end slavery. That was by an Emancipation Proclamation of the Liberator Tsar. We were just about the only place that went to war. I don't find that very good news for the characterization of us as having achieved our wealth and our victory through our inclusive institutions. I find it a fact that we achieved a lot through a lot of barbarism as well, and capitalism has a lot of barbaric aspects to it. It is a set of institutional mechanisms that allow for tremendous violence and tremendous force, and that's true within societies that are considered to be quite civilized, and as well as those that are not civilized. I have found continually in my work, which has taken me to more than 130 countries, that geography matters a tremendous amount all the time. Of course, it matters in the context of the technology of the time. It doesn't surprise me that North America wasn't much developed around in a time when there was no wheat, there were no horses, there was no animal traction in the pre-Columbian period. It was the biggest mistake the Native Americans ever made, by the way, to drive the horse population to extinction about 10,000 years ago, because it meant that for 10,000 years there was no animal traction in the Americas except llamas and camelids in the high Andes. Other than that, this was a continent where in the north you walked. There was no animal traction at all. And it was only when the horse arrived and when wheat arrived, which of course is a Eurasian crop, that it was possible to start a different kind of development. And even within our experience, we know that slavery took in the South were plantations, yellow fever, the difficulties of work under arduous high temperature conditions and many vector diseases, especially yellow fever, and introduced malaria, made slavery an institutional form, and not in the North. That sorted itself out. That wasn't a law. That was a bit of sorting, because there was slavery in New York, there was slavery in the North, but it basically disappeared on its own as a marginal element of society, whereas it became entrenched in the South. I consider that a geographical phenomenon, not as an incident, because it's an incidental one, but as something that happened endogenously in the context of a same civilization, settlement, roughly similar cultural backgrounds, but some became slavers and others became freehold yeoman farmers. And that was not randomly distributed, and it wasn't the difference of national institutions. It had a lot to do with where one grew king cotton or tobacco or sugar and so forth. I have stood in many places where I have just scratched my head, though I have a lot of experience, saying, what the hell can one do in this place? It took me about 20 years to understand that the Anata condition is not an innocent assumption. You know, I thought always that it's great that that curve is very steep near the origin in the Solow model. The nice line goes right underneath it, and sure enough, you go to a high equilibrium. Try that in Timbuktu. Try to find that infinite return that is supposed to be achieved when you have very low capital. I've tried it. I spend a lot of my time trying to think about that. What's the path out of that? There are no roads. There's no power lines. There's no clinics. There's basically no transport. Crops barely grow because you're at a marginal growing season, maybe 90 days. You might get some millet or sorghum in the lucky years. You end up with pastoralism, semi-nomadism, impoverishment, almost no infrastructure at all. And then your job actually is to say, I mean, I take my job as an economist to say, so what to do? What to do? And of course, what happens in such places is people move. They try to move. And in the past, even semi-nomadism requires moving across national borders because you follow the rains. Now you can't do that anymore. There are borders. There are guards. People shoot you. There are marauders. It's very difficult. And if you try to move to, which many landlocked, infrastructure bereft places become sources of outmigration, you end up creating pools of desperate refugees and people drowning in the Mediterranean, and or creating pockets of ethnic impoverished concentration in coastal countries that they go to desperately trying to find some way to survive. I've worked a lot in highland places in the world. highlands are very, very tough in general because transport costs are very high. And so you need some really good luck in the highlands to be able to make it, because you can't do the normal stepping stone of development of labor-intensive manufacturing. You can't get, you don't make t-shirts there. You don't, when we used to have millions of workers putting components on motherboards, which doesn't exist as a job anymore because now machines do it. But when we used to have that, you would not do that in El Alto, outside of La Paz. You would do it on the coast of Vietnam, for example, right across from Taiwan or near Korea and Japan. I had the experience of advising a very market-based government in Bolivia and a very corrupt one-party state government in Vietnam in the 1990s. The corrupt one-party communist state could not stop the massive inflow of foreign investment, even if they tried. The government that was following every rule in Bolivia couldn't get a penny if they tried, other than for the natural resources, which were the only things that could come out of that high transport zone area. It just wasn't enticing to Sony or to Intel or to others to build at 14,000 feet above sea level on a tortuous, very high cost, largely dirt path through the Altiplano and out across an unfriendly border through Chile or through Peru to a port on which there was no control. I tried, but it's really, really hard to get investment in that case. I found that the neighborhood matters a lot for development, and that's because the incentives of the elites that Daron was talking about are also a lot more complicated than the one-dimensional game of elite versus local extraction. Because a lot of what is the real business of politics is trying to stay alive in your neighborhood, trying not to be conquered, trying to compete with your neighbors, trying to be able to also be the spillover of capital investment when enough capital investment saturates a neighbor that it's raising the wages so that you become the next low wage stop, even though you're a little bit less attractive, you're a little bit more inland, you're a little bit more expensive. But the neighboring state has developed to a point where they're now higher wage and your lower wage can attract the capital. So geography matters a lot. And it matters a lot for institutional development. A lot of the history of institutional development is if you get the shit kicked out of you in a war, you reform. And when you look at what happened with the Napoleonic Wars, which was one of the ways that institutions changed in Europe, it changed because when Prussia was defeated by Napoleon in 1805, reform started in 1807. They said, we better do what those guys are doing. It wasn't the game of internal politics, it was the game of international survival. And that makes a very big difference, and I think it's important because it also affects the way institutions diffuse, and the neighborhood effects matter a lot. And, of course, who we kick the shit out of matters a lot also, because the U.S. followed Britain. I don't know if you've seen the map of that inclusive Britain, but they're so inclusive that there's a wonderful map on the internet. You can find the 22 countries of the world that Britain has never invaded. Britain is absolutely astounding. I don't know if I think it's probably too late for them in their career to clean up the rest of the 22. But the United States is close on the heels of Britain because seem to be the same culture, the same manifest destiny for world for world rule, and the same desire to go kick the shit out of other places. And that also makes a big difference. Geopolitics makes a big difference in development. We've really wrecked a lot of countries, and that is not the local politics and the local dynamics, it's the geopolitics. It's been really tough to have oil in the Middle East because, as the sign said, how did our oil get under their sand is a puzzle that the United States is still trying to figure out. And I think that this is another factor. I think another part of the story of development, another part, I could stop now, go on, I'll stop in 2 minutes. I think another part of the story that Daron and his co-authors have written about, and I think that there's some merit to it, but I also think that it's too limited, is the story of England's rise to preeminence in the 19th century. And what that meant for global development is, again, part of my view that we need a much more historical, dynamic, multi-dimensional vision of how these processes work and how they unfold. There are many, many aspects to the rise of Britain, and Daron has pointed to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. I believe that another major part is Thomas Newcomen's steam engine of 1710 and James Watt's improvements of it in the 1770s, and the fact that there was coal that was near the surface and had been used for hundreds of years for heat, and because of a wonderful confluence of many factors from many factors, including good institutions like patent incentives, because that was part, and Glasgow University, because that was part, and readily available coal, because that was part, and lowlands that could be connected with canals, because that was important. A really remarkable thing happened that happened only one time in modern history, and that was the birth of sustained economic growth. And the main breakthrough, in my opinion, of sustained economic growth was the steam engine that unleashed massive energy that transformed every economic sector. But to get to the steam engine required so many good things happening that, to my mind, it reminds me a little bit like what must have been in the murky soup that got self-replicating life started at some point where some hydrophilic fat globule or hydrophobic fat globule surrounded some RNA, and life began in the same way. Lots of good things came together, and that's when modern economic growth took off. It was literally impossible without an energy revolution. And when the energy revolution occurred, then one can watch the diffusion of that. And one interesting part of the diffusion within Europe itself is that you can track the growth almost to the miles from London across Europe in the 19th century, because it goes from west to east, it goes from north to south, and it takes a diffusion process that one can watch and actually track. And quite fascinatingly, you can track it down to the most micro level, because British industrial firms set up operations in the neighbors. And that was part of the business, of course, of technological diffusion. So to my mind, all of this has to be part of our story and a rich tableau. I believe institutions matter, certainly. I've seen it, and I've worked in places that were destroyed by despotic governments, that were destroyed by occupations by neighboring powers. I was the advisor in Poland's post-communist reforms. I've seen and know firsthand what institutional derangement can mean. But I've also seen lots and lots of other cases where that isn't the particular challenge at hand. It just happens to be something else. And I'll just end by mentioning that maybe because I'm lucky enough to have married a wonderful medical doctor and a clinician 36 years ago, I watched my wife take hundreds of night calls and came to marvel at the beauty of good clinical practice. And the marvel of good clinical practice is you ask a lot of questions and you do it in a very organized, systematic way that you're highly trained. The first question on a fever is your baby's neck stiff? Because if it is, you go straight to the hospital. I'm not going to ask you another question. We have to rule out meningitis. So there's a whole cascade of questions that you ask to identify and then treat a febrile condition, a fever. And the beauty of a differential diagnosis is you know that what can go wrong in your pathology textbook is a book this thick. And you're trying in the context to figure out what in the circumstances you're looking at is the condition that you're observing. And I find that, for me, an extremely helpful way to understand what I regard as good economic practice. Thank you.
As mentioned, we're going to have a 35-minute formal question and answer session. I think, given that we have dueling podiums, why don't both of our presenters come up in front? And if you notice, there are two microphone stands.
Big guy, be nice to me, Daron.
Yeah, presuming you guys can get along for 35 minutes. But if you have a question, please just queue up at the microphone stands. I suppose since no one's standing, I'll take moderator privileges. I'm curious to hear what each of your respective takes on the work of James Scott would be, given that he focuses on the geographic role of how indigenous populations can evade extractive forms of state institutions. So he would seem to be a sort of like hybrid between both of your perspectives. I'm curious to hear if you guys are familiar or have thoughts on that.
Okay, actually, that's great. Thank you. Because I actually wanted to clarify one thing. So, and I think this perhaps should have been clarified more in our book, but it perhaps is a little between the lines. But when we say that geography doesn't matter too much, we don't mean that geography has no effect via institutions. Obviously, geography has a major effect via institutions, and I'll link that to James Scott. But what it means is that, oftentimes geography has an effect via institutions in a specific historical context. So, for example, in our work, we have, emphasized, malaria, which, Jeff talks about, but much more in the context of how it influences European settlements, or population density in the context of how different amounts of population density, which had of course, geographic element at the turn of the 15th century, influenced European settlements. Or in the paper that we wrote on the rise of Europe, we emphasized how access to the Atlantic had a major effect on the development of different social groups and trade for European countries. All of these are geographic characteristics, but the story goes through institutions. So that's very much consistent with James Scott. And in fact, some of the ideas I'm talking about there do build, extend, but also modify James Scott's ideas, in that James Scott's important sort of contribution, in several books, and I'm sort of digressing a little bit, but is that it's very important to think of the power of and social norms of society in being able to constrain state. And if you look at what I emphasize as region 1 and 2 in that figure. I might even go there since as we're talking. It's very much related to James Scott's ideas, but and then James Scott in his last book, especially on the art of not being governed, as Dan says, adds this idea that, in fact, an additional way in which society avoided the control of the state was by running away. So in mountainous areas with high elevation, it was very difficult for a state to apply a uniform set of laws, or what he called legibility, in order to be able to govern it in some particular way, and that was important for the development of the state. I think all of these are very important ideas, and some of them make their way into our work, into our ongoing work. But I think what James Scott does not sort of take into account is the important, very, very rich benefits of having that state capacity, and at the same time, how to control that state capacity. So in some sense, his anarchist story is about all state capacity being bad, whereas what we're trying to say is that state capacity is bad when it cannot be controlled, and really trying to think systematically about how to control it.
I don't understand how geography, I don't understand the thinking, because I don't agree with it, how geography can have so important an effect on institutions, but it has no direct effect on the economy itself. The reason geography has an effect on institutions is that it really affects costs. It affects costs of doing things. Being near the Atlantic meant that you could trade in the Atlantic. It made a huge difference. Malaria has an effect even today because millions of people are afflicted by it, not just in 1800. And so it doesn't seem to me that that exclusion restriction works. That yes, it's extraordinarily important, but it all goes through the one thing I want to talk about, institutions. Maybe it affects institutions at some times, but the reason it affects institutions is that it has a very powerful effect on what kinds of technologies one has, the ability of countries to defend themselves, the ability of countries to trade costs. Economics is to a huge extent about the costs of deploying particular technologies. Some places it's impossible to deploy particular technologies because they're ecologically or resource dependent. Or some places it's very hard because transport costs are so high that what we know to be absolutely essential for development, which is trade, becomes itself prohibitive. So people are pushed into very remote areas. They develop absolutely wonderful, lovely, distinctive cultures. And some of the most colorful, distinctive, insightful cultures are in remote, mountainous environments because a lot of wonderful human thinking and invention and art and so forth is possible, but not trade. Trade's very expensive. And so the diffusion of technology follows patterns of geography, ecology, where crops can be grown, where animals can be grown, where minerals, oil, and other resources exist. I do think that it's absolutely true that as you become richer, these transport costs diminish in centrality often because you have other things to sell and you can overcome transport costs. And so that doesn't, to my mind, change the fact of how crucial these factors are in the path that an economy takes. So, yes, you write a lot about how geography works, but only through one channel. I see it working through multiple channels.
Yeah, I mean, I think just if I can just add one word, I mean, on that, I mean, I think, the specific instances where we emphasize are really geography mattering to a particular historical juncture. So that's why, for example, with the Atlantic, you can see, countries with a lot of Atlantic coast not growing any differentially until, the discovery of the New World and the rounding of the Cape Hope.
Of course.
And then those are opening up. So let me give you another example of what I'm trying to say. let me use the work by Melissa Dell rather than my own work to illustrate it. So the Bolivia example, sure, Bolivia has a different geography, but it's not a different geography that's been always an impediment to economic growth. You know, the Inca Empire was very much able to have very complex trading routes during that period. And the beauty of what her empirical design is that she looks at the effect of a particular political institution, the MITA, the forced labor system, very much related to what I'm talking about. And you can do that within Bolivia and Peru in a way that entirely controls the effect of geography, because you're comparing places just outside and just inside the catchment area. And after almost 300 years after the formal forced labor systems are sort of abolished, you have today 30% differences between places, and in a place where essentially there is some labor mobility, you have 30% differences between places that were subject to forced labor versus they weren't. So, if you want to explain Bolivia's problems today, I think it's very difficult to think of how these indigenous communities that have been subject to centuries of repression, amazing amount of repression, are irrelevant, and you just want to talk about the problem of geography. I think that's going to be hard.
I don't think that they're irrelevant at all. They're of course relevant. They're one of the things that's relevant. So is being at 14,000 feet above sea level in a landlocked country. That's still also absolutely relevant. I don't see one or the other. I don't see why we're in a situation where we're choosing between the two. I could agree with what you're saying. It sounds very interesting, but it doesn't also deny the other point. That's what a complex system is. Many things are going on, not just one thing.
Let's move on to another question.
Thanks very much for for a very interesting debate that's already proceeding. I'm curious about the mechanism of diffusion that you refer to in terms of why geography matters. Now, this makes me think of the work of a political economist who was writing 50 years ago, Alexander Gerschenkron, who also talked about geography as very important as a motivation why France, Germany, and Russia each wanted to catch up to their preceding their industrializing predecessors. The mechanism that he described was that states needed to mobilize sufficient capital in order to provide public infrastructure, and especially trains, which very much addresses the issue of trade and transport that you identify. But it strikes me that ultimately what Gerschenkron was talking about is that a process of what appears as geographic diffusion requires a mechanism that is institutional in its scope. How would you address that theoretical premise?
I think without question, economies depend on technology, physical resource base, and institutional framework. So it's not surprising that all of those elements are part of any adequate understanding. What Gerschenkron specifically was emphasizing was something a little bit different, what he called the advantages of relative backwardness, and what we now call conditional convergence. And that's the idea that if you're far behind the technology leader, there's a capacity to move faster towards the technology frontier. And what Gerschenkron was arguing, very interestingly, was that the institutions you would use for catching up would be different depending on the size of the gap. And that would be both politically motivated, perhaps ideologically motivated, but also substantively motivated. And I think that this is a very important basic point. Again, if I would make a very simple, too simple point, but I think it's a good starting point for this discussion. You can distinguish conceptually innovation and diffusion. And innovation may take place more under certain kinds of conditions, and diffusion may require other kinds of institutions. Diffusion's not so much about discovery, but diffusion is about application. And so it's possible to be a relatively low innovating society at a point of your history and growing very rapidly. And that's by closing the gap. And for that, the institutions for catching up are probably most important. Do you have a good capacity to reverse engineer? Do you have a good education system? Have you put in the infrastructure? Maybe you've not invented, but you've developed some particular institutions that aren't particularly inclusive, but are export processing zones where at very low cost labor, you're able to bring in technology from outside and use that as a catching up instrument. So what Gerschenkron was after in comparing France, Germany, and Russia was the claim that the farther behind, the more there was a state push. And that was his 1952 essay. I would say we see that in China, for example. China does not have many of these inclusive institutions, but it's the fastest growing country in the world over the last 40 years. It has certain, but I would not call it. If you would, to my mind, that just shows how squishy these concepts are, because I do not view China as, what I view China as being remarkably effective at catching up. And that, I think, is part of an example of the Gerschenkron approach. So that, I think that if you think about it in those terms, then you can ask a lot of questions. What's most important? And that's why a strong state, for example, that is not a particularly inclusive one, it may be, well, let me not even elaborate on that, except to say a strong state that can build roads, that can build ports, that can get the infrastructure in place, may be the kind that is then able to catch up fastest. And that may be quite different from the kind of institutions that would have generated the innovations in the first place, which might have been much more gradual, much more open, much more experimental and evolutionary, whereas what China's doing is copying, and it's up to a point. Now it's in a new phase, actually, even literally with the new 13th plan. But the catching up phase was, we're building these roads, we're doing this method of development in order to put a platform for rapid catching up. That's the Gerschenkron hypothesis.
So we should keep on talking, because we're going to find more and more things that Jeff and I agree on, like an appreciation for Gerschenkron. So, I think Jeff gave a very good summary of that, and I'm a huge fan of him, and a huge fan of his, and in fact wrote a paper precisely trying to formalize and extend this idea that distance to the technological frontier affects the form of institutions that you have, or affects the form of institutions that might be most growth enhancing. But I think Jeff is slightly underplaying the role that the difficulty that other societies might have in getting to that path in the first place. In fact, Gerschenkron indeed put a lot of emphasis on railways, and he, in his other work, not in the economic backwardness, the advantages of economic backwardness, and in his other works, he also emphasized how Russian state was very much opposed to building building railways, and also the Habsburg Empire under Francis I and Maria Theresa were hugely opposed to the diffusion of railways to their empire, precisely because they thought that this would destabilize the system, reduce their political power. And I think that's exactly the sort of thing that is useful as a set of lenses for thinking about China, which, of course we may be wrong, but we spent, more than a chapter on this in our book, trying to sort of understand China. And I think to a first approximation, simplifying it hugely, the China story is a combination of a very radical change in economic institutions, which sort of went away from the early Russia, early Habsburg Empire to the later periods where they were more open to technology, especially with Deng Xiaoping's rise, but also a large dose of extractive growth, which is, the political control remains under the sort of the Communist Party, and economic institutions are partially liberalized, but again, the state and state control play a very important political role in that. And that's particularly good, especially if you want to go into capital-intensive areas, but it's going to be very bad, and that's what I was talking about briefly, it's going to be very bad at underpinning sustained economic growth because it's not nurturing innovation. It can work with diffusion. It can work with exploiting your competitive advantages, like Barbados did with sugar, or Saudi Arabia might be able to do for a while with oil. But it's not going to translate into sustained economic growth based on innovation, and that's exactly what China is having as a problem. And I'm not as optimistic. So I think most of this we agree with Jeff, but I'm not as optimistic as the 13th plan, which is, the solution to all of these problems is to increase the Communist Party's control at some level. So,
well, just another word about China. If you look at the pattern when China opened up, it's absolutely going from the coast inward in almost every way. It started actually with the special economic zones, which were the same port zones of the open door policy 100 years ago when the West pried open China for trade. So geographically, it started right at the coasts. In fact, of course, Shenzhen went from, which is the suburb of Hong Kong, just in the mainland, went from 23,000 people in 1980 to, I think it's even more than 10. It may be 15 million. Pardon me, I don't remember exactly the number, but it became a metropolis that is extraordinary because it's right at the border with Hong Kong. Shanghai similarly has a kind of geographic role that New York City does at the estuary of the main river tributary, which the Hudson used to be in the 19th century for the United States. And over time, there's diffusion into the interior, the one exception being Chongqing and Chengdu, which are big interior cities. They're a little bit like Chicago, I would say, from an economic role. They're the breadbasket cities connected by the Yangtze to Shanghai, just like Chicago was connected to New York through the Erie Canal. So you see a lot of geography taking place, and that's where how a lot of the diffusion mechanism has also worked. I would say also on future prospects, of course, no one knows. We're talking about 20% of humanity, so it's a pretty open. I tend to be more optimistic. I think the big difference, I think you make an analogy in your book to the Soviet Union, and that China will go the same way, but I think there's one absolutely fundamental difference with the Soviet Union, and that is that the Soviet system, which achieved a tremendous amount, actually, often at great brutality, but it achieved a tremendous amount, developed a parallel technology because of the nature of the Cold War and the nature of the Soviet system and the nature of the US response to the Soviet system, and that parallel technology was just not as good. Whereas China is fundamentally fully integrated into the world technology system. There's no parallel technology taking place. And I think that this is probably the single most important difference of the China trajectory and the Soviet Union trajectory. The Soviet Union just ended up with an inferior set of technologies that ended up collapsing. They couldn't compete in the end, especially in the semiconductor era. Whereas China is fully part of it. And I think China's institutions will evolve, but I don't want to be glib about it because, yes, of course, there are huge political, structural changes for a fifth of humanity to make any kind of dynamic change of the amount that's taking place in China. But on the whole, I tend to be more optimistic.
Next question.
This is a question for Daron. So in your talk, you gave many examples of situations in which countries adopted different institutions somewhat by chance. And so do you actually see this as the fundamental driving force of this map that you showed in the initial slides? Or if not, do you think that there's some other fundamental driving force which is determining the institutions in the different places?
I think that I hesitate to answer this question because my belief is that there is actually quite a bit of a random element to institutional adoption, especially at the very early phases of humanity. But on the other hand, that might just be my ignorance. So, for example, Jared Diamond's view, which I'm sure Jeff to some degree shares, is that, if you want to understand where agriculture developed, you really have to think of geographic elements, the lucky latitudes, and where the domesticable animals and domesticable crops were. I think that certainly does play some role, because you couldn't have it when these things were not present. But when you look at where those lucky latitudes are, it's a huge area. And within that, you see a huge variety of institutions, some of them very successful, some of them not. And I think, to the best of my understanding, a lot of that from the anthropologists who have studied it does not have any systematic explanation. I think some of it just comes from the way in which some conflicts are resolved. Some of it comes because some leader engages in some sort of state-building project that is able to form the right coalitions, and that's inherently random. But again, all of that might be just a reflection of my ignorance, and that other factors that others will come up with might reduce all of that so it might increase the R square, leaving less for those random factors. But I do believe in the importance of the random factors, certainly.
Yeah, maybe I could just say a few words about this. First, I really do think it's important to keep in mind that what we consider development and what we consider the era of economic growth, or what I would consider the era of economic growth, is pretty short in this period. So it really is not exactly the same, but it's close to the Industrial Revolution onward. And of course, there were variations before the Industrial Revolution, but when Daron says that the Inca Empire was quite developed, not economically, and maybe it's interesting, the reach of the empire and geographic reach, and it had many extraordinary accomplishments, but it was pretty basic level of subsistence. And they had llamas that could go up and down the Andean mountains from the coastal cities up to Machu Picchu and Ayacucho and Lake Titicaca. But it was subsistence of anything that we would regard as remotely compared to modern development. So I think that at least to study modern economic development, it's important to draw a sharp distinction, which I think history and the economic logic justifies. And then that forces us to ask particular questions of what the breakthroughs are, what the technology. I've already expressed my own view that the energy breakthrough was a very decisive element of that. And if there was there's lots of precursors, starting with the discovery of the Americas and the change of technology, mentality, land, labor ratios, and other things that were involved in that. But I do think that we should keep quantitatively in mind some of these distinctions. When it comes to the nature of these institutional changes, one factor that I think is really interesting and important to look at is military power, because a tremendous amount of institutional change comes through conquest or domination or the forced spread of civilization. And one of the peculiarities for me that I think tells us a lot is the Mongol success. And I point to the Mongol success because here you had a nomadic, very small population that created the largest landmass empire in the history of the world, conquered the far more sophisticated the most sophisticated culture and society in the pre-industrial history, which was China. And it's a puzzle. And I point to the puzzle for one reason. I think it was technology, and technology linked to geography. They had grasslands that could grow the world's best horses. And in the pre-automobile, pre-tank, pre-aviation age, horses was it. They were the animal traction. They were the only way you could go fast on the whole planet, other than sail. But if you wanted to go over land, you had no option. And I find it fascinating. I just raise it as what I regard as one of history's great oddities and great puzzles. There's no way in the world you could say the Mongol civilizations were culturally, technologically, scientifically advanced except in their ability to conquer. And that was absolutely distinctively a horse-based culture, and that had the odd feature of the Eurasian steppe civilizations. And so I just raised that as another peculiarity. I don't think it really explains too much of modern economic development issues, but it does show how a technological advantage in a military way can lead to profound political and institutional advantages. Otherwise, there's no explanation for it that I know of.
William McNeill is what I recommend.
So this is a question about development economics, and I was wondering what you guys thought of the last chapter of Deaton's last book, The Great Escape. And he's talking about human progress and how mortality has gone down a lot in the last 400 years or so. And I think the last chapter can be summarized as saying basically that one of the problems with giving development aid is that it undermines the contract between the government and its citizens. That by sort of giving sustained help, you reduce the incentive that the government has to provide good services. I have a pretty good idea of how you two would respond, but I was wondering if you guys could comment specifically on that argument.
Oh, God. I always found
So you found somebody to disagree more than with me?
No. I find it really, really frustrating and sad. And he should know better. And I've had, unfortunately, sometimes not so pleasant exchanges with him. It's not demeaning to save people's lives. You didn't weaken the contract of government and society by having poor people have bed nets or actually be able to have their child cured of malaria. I can't tell you what it's like, actually, without you experiencing it, to be in places where children die of a mosquito bite, and where that's not the will of governments, that's poverty. And that's not something that just one wishes away or ignores or thinks is somehow part of this play. It's not, and I shouldn't say that, but I just regard this as morally unserious and intellectually incorrect. Because when you face serious challenges like this that can be addressed at low cost, it's a shame to believe that we can't do something about this. In 1990, 13 million kids died before their 5th birthday. That year, 13 million kids under the age of 5. Last year, it was 6 million. That's 6 million too many in my view, but it's 7 million saved by action, not just by the flow of history, but because there are vaccines and there are medicines and there are interventions. Some of it would have happened through getting richer, but a lot of it was accelerated. And for the life of me, the idea that this somehow weakens, that strengthens despotism or weakens society is just a gloss that is not serious. And if he really felt that it's serious, then I would say it has to be a major challenge if you know you can save millions of lives every year and you can't figure out institutionally a way to solve that particular problem. Come on. It's inevitable that there's no way to save the lives without also doing damage to politics. Frankly, the whole argument is absurd to me. But the idea that if it was real, that it wouldn't be a primary challenge rather than washing your hands of it, I also can't understand at all.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sachs, for your comments. So, I grew up in a country that gets a lot of development aid from the United States and all
Which
over
one?
the world. Pakistan.
Pakistan.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm gonna push back
That's an
on
exception.
that.
No, it's not an exception. The idea that aid is just a blob is also not my point. My point isn't you hand money over and that makes results. My point is that we can do things that can make a difference. Now, you're going to ask about, I'll say a lot about Pakistan, but
Perhaps you want to hear her question.
absolutely.
So I am definitely. So I find it hard to imagine that. I find the claim that if you have an influx of development aid into a country coming from the outside, that would not weaken institutions.
That it would not?
That it would. I find that if you have development aid coming from the outside, I'm saying that it probably would weaken institutions, as I've seen in the place where I'm from. I'm not saying that, combating malaria or reducing child mortality or any of those things aren't important. I think we can both acknowledge that they are important. But isn't it more... But I also find it difficult to rely on these external engines as long-term sort of paths to growth. I think that given that we are within a nation-state system, if we weren't in a nation-state system and we were all one big happy free society, maybe, if you just gave money to people and helped them out, that would be perfect. But given that we have a fragmented global society, I also think that it's very hard to say that allowing local institutions to strengthen to be able to help their own citizens, that's not equally, if not more important, because I think that is a more compelling vessel to long-term growth. Because what if the aid stops coming? What if, for some reason, I don't know, something really bad happens and the U.S. has no more aid to you? The social safety
We
net.
elect Trump as president.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. So I find, I am very much with you that we need to help people, but I don't think you can ignore the detrimental effects of development aid on growth.
Yeah, I don't think there are detrimental effects of aid on growth. I think there are detrimental effects of the CIA on Pakistan. That's a completely different thing. It's a completely different thing. The U.S.
They're happening in
U.S.
parallel.
They, of course, happen in parallel. And a lot of aid is disgusting. Disgusting. And it's done for real reasons that have nothing to do with development. And so, of course, we have to think. And there are a lot of quack doctors. And there are a lot of doctors that do surgery that should never be done. And that doesn't mean that medicine is wrong. It means that there's a lot of quackery. Pakistan faces enormous problems, one of which has been its alliance with the United States for 60 years. And the history of that, and the intelligence agencies of Pakistan and the CIA together, for many reasons, Cold War reasons, made a horrendous disaster. So I'm not at all saying that anything the U.S. does that gets in a column that says aid, that I recommend it. Of course not. I'm as much a critic of U.S. foreign policy as anyone in this room. And I also don't want to be misunderstood. I'm saying we have the means to think about how to address these problems as professional development thinkers, as public health specialists, as infrastructure specialists. I'm not saying that the way that the world system works is right, fair, just. I'm not saying that aid as it is used in Iraq or in Pakistan or in other places is anything short of a disaster. So it's just a matter of maybe terminology or clarity. I'm not saying the real system, because we have a system, is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the capacity to do something different and to identify, as I believe the examples that I gave have made clear, that it's possible to do things that are beneficial, economic development promoting, but not decisive, by the way, because the real long story of development is not going to come from the outside. This is obvious. You have to be an idiot to believe otherwise. And I'm not an idiot. But I believe that it can make a difference, and a positive difference. That doesn't mean that everything that goes, I can't stand USAID half the time because it's an instrument of US military policy. And I could go on for a long time about it. But that's not at all what I'm talking about.
Thank you.
So, I mean, let me sort of try to give a perspective, which, of course, is just a perspective, and I'm not going to back it up with data, but at the moment. But, I mean, I think there are a couple of things you want to distinguish here, and I think this refers to the previous question also. The first one is whether you think aid is a solution to long-run economic problems. You know, my understanding of Jeff's view was that in the past that it was because it could get you out of the increasing returns to scale region, et cetera. Perhaps that's changed a little bit, in which case we agree more, that I think, you know, aid is not a solution to long-run economic problems. The second is, how effective is aid? I think I would say moderate. Jeff would say, when done well, perhaps very, and Angus Seaton and Bill Easterly and some other people would say not at all. I would certainly say moderate. You know, the evidence that I think is pretty serious is that perhaps $1 or $2 out of $10 given reaches its target. But, you know, that makes it still much better than anything else. So if you're gonna not waste it, and if you're not gonna use it for, you know, CIA aid, as Jeff was saying, it's probably better that, you know, we spend $10 out of this room and $1 or $2 goes to the poorest people in the world. That's great. But you have to be careful, and you're 100% right there. You have to be careful in doing that aid does not ruin economic and political institutions. And we have plenty of examples in which it was done badly, CIA or other institutions. I'm not just going to blame the CIA, although, you know, it gets its own share of blame, in which it was done really badly. And I think Angus Deaton's position, I think, though extreme sounding and perhaps extreme, I mean, I would say there is some potential justification, but also the other side of the coin. Again, I'll just go back to that picture. So in that picture, if you just give the aid in such a way that you make the state institutions strong when they shouldn't be strong, or you take from the state precisely the things that it can manage well so that it can build trust, which I think many NGOs do. You know, what the state needs to do in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia is that it needs to build some basic amounts of effectiveness and efficacy and trust. And if you take the easiest stuff from that state, you're actually going to make it much harder. But on the other hand, if the state is badly failing at damage control after a flood, or it can't control an epidemic, you know, help from the outside may actually increase the effectiveness of the state. So I think it's very much context dependent whether outside aid is going to help institutions building or it's going to damage institutions building. So I think it's a topic that we should think about much more systematically. So I do disagree with Angus that it always damages institutions building, but I do, I guess, disagree with Jeff that that's a question we should not even ask.
Wait a minute.
And-
Wait a minute.
What? You mean you?
I just said I
You
was
said
about
that
I was
I'm
I was about
asking
I was
that
I was
question.
about to say that I agreed with you 100%.
Okay, good. This is a great place to end it.
Until you disagreed with me. It's exactly.
Yeah,
I
100%.
have spent a lot of time thinking carefully about contexts in practical cases for 25 years, and so I agree with you. And I thought your summary of it was perfect. There was no disagreement
Okay,
whatsoever.
perfect. I just misunderstood your answer to
Yeah.
Angus, that you said that his view was, expressing that view was callous. And
It is callous. It's callous to wipe it off like that.
well, I'm not
it's-
sure whether
it-
he's wiping it off or he's
Well, he
raising
is.
concerns. You know?
No. He's not raising concerns. He's saying, what a waste. Don't do it. If he was raising concerns, we could all jump up and say, let's solve that.
Okay, we agree
Let's address those
100%
concerns.
except about Angus, so that's fine.
Progress.
That's going to conclude our question and answer portion. Let's thank our